Welcome to another amazing story. I'm the storyteller, and without further ado, once upon a time.
In the heart of a medieval village nestled beneath towering cliffs, Grace, a merchant's daughter, found herself constantly battling the rigid expectations of her community. Her days were spent helping her father manage their modest tavern, a place of warmth and life, but also the center of the village's harshest judgments. While the clinking of tankards and laughter echoed within its walls, outside, whispers and side glances painted her as something unworthy of respect. To them, a woman working amidst such lowly surroundings was scandalous, a betrayal of what they believed a lady ought to be. Yet Grace stood firm, torn between her duty to her family and the weight of the villagers' disdain. It wasn't just the whispers that stung, but the suffocating sense of being an outcast in her own home. The village, bound by centuries-old traditions, saw virtue only in women who conformed to a narrow mold, quiet, modest, and confined to their households. Grace, with her sharp mind and compassionate heart, knew she didn't fit that image, and the thought gnawed at her spirit. Even those who enjoyed the warmth of the tavern's hearth seemed reluctant to defend her, fearful of being associated with someone deemed improper. In a world where survival often depended on community, isolation felt like a punishment far worse than the biting winter winds. Her father's tavern, though lively with travelers and villagers alike, became a double-edged sword, a place of both pride and shame. Grace would overhear tales of far-off lands, knights braving snowstorm struggles, and love found in medieval taverns. These stories fueled her imagination and gave her hope, yet the reality remained grim. Every pint she served was a reminder that to the villagers, she was merely a girl without a place, a curiosity in a world rigidly defined by roles. Rescue and survival in such a place weren't about swords and battles, but navigating the treacherous waters of societal scorn. Grace often wondered if empathy could bridge the gap between her and the villagers, but such a notion seemed like folly. The elders, staunch protectors of tradition, scowled at her presence, muttering about the disgrace of a woman serving in a public house. Even the younger men, who stole glances her way, were quick to avert their eyes, fearing association. Yet within her, there burned a quiet defiance, a refusal to believe she was destined to live a life of shame for simply being herself. Her heart longed for freedom, for something more than this endless cycle of judgment and survival. Late at night, when the tavern grew silent and the only sound was the crackle of the dying fire, Grace would sit alone, lost in thought. She dreamt of escape, of a world where she wouldn't need to carry the burden of others' expectations. The idea of a solitary night rescuing her from this prison of whispers felt almost laughable. Yet, deep down, she clung to that fantasy. Not because she believed in fairy tales, but because it gave her the strength to face another day. Perhaps compassion and unexpected romance could exist even in a world so cold and unkind. Her mother, long gone, had once told her that the world outside their village was vast and filled with possibilities. Grace clung to those words, letting them guide her through the darkest days. But as the years passed, the weight of medieval morality grew heavier, and the tavern became a prison she couldn't escape. Her father, though kind, didn't understand the depths of her despair. He saw the tavern as their lifeline, but to Grace, it was a chain. She wanted to break free, to discover who she truly was beyond the labels and roles forced upon her. And so, one fateful evening, with the winter wind howling through the village and snowflakes beginning to coat the ground, Grace made a decision. She would leave the judgmental stares behind and venture out into the unknown. Though she had no clear plan, her heart told her that rescue and survival were not things others could offer her. She had to find them herself. Little did she know, the storm brewing outside would soon test her resolve and lead her to a destiny she never imagined.
If you like emotional medieval stories, you can help us by subscribing, activating the bell, and leaving your like. Comment what touched you most in this story.
As the snowstorm raged, Grace wrapped herself in a threadbare cloak, determined to leave the village behind. The biting cold seeped through the fabric, but she pressed on, her footsteps barely audible over the howling winds. The world around her turned to a blur of white, each snowflake a silent reminder of the danger she faced. She had never ventured far from the village, and now, with the storm growing stronger, every step felt like a gamble. Yet, the thought of returning to the judgmental eyes and crushing whispers fueled her resolve. The path she chose was unfamiliar, a winding trail that disappeared beneath the fresh snowfall. Branches bowed under the weight of ice, their cracking sounds echoing like distant warnings. Grace clutched her cloak tighter, each gust of wind cutting deeper into her skin. Her thoughts flickered to stories of travelers lost in storms, of solitary nights braving nature's fury. She wondered if this was how they felt, small, insignificant, and at the mercy of forces far greater than themselves. The snowstorm, it seemed, wasn't just a test of her strength but of her spirit. Hours passed, though it felt like days, and Grace's legs grew heavy, her breath shallow. The once quiet beauty of the snow now felt like a cruel trap, its endless expanse offering no landmarks, no refuge. She stumbled, her feet sinking deeper with every misstep, and panic began to creep in. The storm wasn't just outside. It was within her, clouding her thoughts and weakening her resolve. Desperation gripped her heart as she realized she had lost her way, both on the path and within herself. It was a sharp, invisible edge beneath the snow that finally brought her to the ground. Grace let out a cry as her ankle twisted painfully, the sound swallowed instantly by the roaring winds. She tried to rise, but the pain shot through her leg, forcing her back down. The storm didn't relent, its icy tendrils wrapping around her as if to claim her for its own. She screamed for help, her voice hoarse and barely audible in the chaos. For the first time, the weight of her decision to leave the village felt like a mistake she couldn't undo. Lying there, her body sinking into the cold embrace of the snow, Grace's thoughts turned to her father. She had left without a word, and now, she wondered if he would ever know what had become of her. Tears mixed with the snowflakes on her face as she thought of the tavern, of the warmth she had taken for granted. Her resolve to escape the judgment of others had led her to the brink of survival, and now she faced the very real possibility that no one would find her in time. The snowstorm was no longer a symbol of her defiance, but of her vulnerability. As the storm continued its relentless assault, Grace's strength began to fade. Her limbs grew numb, and the pain in her ankle dulled, replaced by an eerie calm. She found herself drifting between consciousness and oblivion, her mind grasping at fleeting images of hope, of rescue, of survival. The stories she had heard of nights and snowstorm struggles felt like distant dreams, unattainable and cruel. Yet, in her heart, a flicker of hope remained, a stubborn refusal to surrender entirely to the storm. Somewhere out there, someone might still hear her silent plea. And then, through the blinding flurry of snow, a shadow appeared, a figure moving with purpose, defying the storm's fury. Grace's vision blurred, but she clung to the sight, willing it to be real. She tried to call out, but her voice failed her. As darkness closed in, she felt strong arms lifting her from the snow, the warmth of another's presence breaking through the cold. Little did she know, this solitary night would change the course of her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The storm showed no mercy as Caleb, a solitary knight exiled by choice, trudged through the thick snow near his secluded cabin. The cold bit at his face, but years of surviving alone had hardened him against such trials. The woods were silent save for the wind's roar, yet something unusual caught his eye, a faint outline in the snow. His instincts as both a warrior and a man of compassion urged him forward. As he approached, he saw her, a young woman, pale and unmoving, the storm threatening to claim her life. Without hesitation, Caleb knelt beside her, his calloused hands brushing the snow from her face. Her lips were blue, her breathing faint, and a pang of urgency gripped his heart. He had long chosen solitude over the company of others, but in this moment, his isolation felt like a selfish luxury. Scooping her into his arms, he marveled at how fragile she seemed, her frame almost weightless against his strength. The storm was no match for Caleb's determination as he carried her back to his cabin, each step a battle against the elements. Inside the safety of his cabin, Caleb set her gently near the fire, his mind racing with thoughts of survival. He removed her soaked cloak and wrapped her in furs, his hands steady despite the urgency of the situation. Her face, though pale, bore a quiet strength, and Caleb found himself wondering what had driven her into the storm. He stoked the fire, the warmth slowly chasing away the chill that clung to her. In the solitude of his cabin, where only silence and survival had been his companions, the presence of another soul felt both strange and oddly comforting. As the hours passed, Grace stirred, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal eyes filled with confusion and fear. Caleb, a man of few words, spoke softly, reassuring her that she was safe. Her voice was faint as she whispered her gratitude, but her expression betrayed both relief and wariness. Caleb respected her silence, offering her broth he had prepared and giving her space to adjust. He didn't pry into her story, though curiosity gnawed at him. Why was she out there, alone, in such a deadly storm? His cabin, once a fortress of solitude, now felt like a sanctuary shared. In the days that followed, Grace's strength returned, though her ankle kept her confined to the cabin. Caleb, ever the practical survivalist, ensured she had everything she needed, from warmth to sustenance. Their conversations were sparse but meaningful, each word revealing glimpses of who they were. Grace, though grateful, couldn't shake her unease. Being at the mercy of a stranger, no matter how kind, was a vulnerability she wasn't used to. Yet, Caleb's actions spoke louder than any words could. His care was meticulous, his demeanor stoic yet kind, and she found herself trusting him more with each passing day. For Caleb, her presence was a disruption he hadn't anticipated. His life had been one of solitary discipline, a rhythm unbroken for years. And yet, watching Grace regain her spirit and strength brought an unexpected warmth to his otherwise cold existence. She spoke of a life in a judgmental village, of whispers and expectations that felt like chains. Caleb, though not one to share much of himself, found a quiet solidarity in her struggles. They were two souls marked by survival, each carrying scars, each searching for a place to belong, even if neither would admit it out loud. As Grace grew stronger, she began to feel the weight of her reality creeping back. The storm had been her escape, but now, under Caleb's watchful care, she realized the world she had left behind would not easily let her go. Caleb, too, sensed that her stay in his cabin was temporary, that the fragile bond forming between them would soon be tested by forces beyond their control. Unspoken questions lingered between them, about honor, about survival, and about what fate had in store. Outside, the snow began to thaw, signaling that the storm had passed, but the real trials were only beginning. The village square, once a place Grace avoided, now became a stage where her honor was dissected under sharp gazes and hushed whispers. As she limped through the cobbled streets with her father by her side, the townsfolk's judgment weighed heavily on her. Rumors of her unchaperoned time in Caleb's cabin spread like wildfire, fueled by a community eager for scandal. To them, the details didn't matter. What mattered was the breach of propriety. Grace, though strong in spirit, felt the sting of their accusations, unspoken yet deafening in their intensity. Her father, a man who had always shielded her, now found himself defending not just his daughter but his livelihood. The tavern became quieter, its regulars choosing to avoid a family caught in the center of controversy. Grace could see the lines of worry deepening on her father's face, each one a reminder that their world was unraveling. She wanted to speak, to shout the truth, that Caleb had saved her life, but she knew the villagers wouldn't care. In their eyes, her time away was a stain that couldn't be erased, a mark that tarnished not just her but her family's reputation. Even the elders, who prided themselves on their wisdom, didn't spare her from their judgment. They murmured about the disgrace of a young woman staying in a man's cabin, regardless of the circumstances. Grace, once defiant against their whispers, now found herself shrinking under their scrutiny. The village's morality, rigid and unyielding, left no room for compassion or understanding. Caleb's role as her rescuer was ignored, his actions twisted into something dishonorable. Grace's heart ached at the injustice, but she knew that fighting back would only deepen the divide. As days turned into weeks, the pressure mounted. Women who once smiled at her now looked away, their silence louder than any words. The men, too, kept their distance, their glances filled with suspicion and curiosity. Grace's world, already small, seemed to shrink further, leaving her isolated in a way she had never known. Her father urged her to stay strong, but even his voice wavered under the weight of their shared burden. The tavern's warmth was replaced by a chilling emptiness, a reflection of the community's rejection. Caleb, though far removed from the village, felt the ripples of its judgment through the rare visits he made for supplies. The looks he received were a mix of fear and disdain, as though his very presence confirmed the worst of the rumors. He said nothing, his stoic demeanor masking the anger that simmered within. Caleb had saved Grace without hesitation, yet the world now painted him as a villain. His solitude, once a choice, now felt like a punishment, a reminder that honor was often dictated by those who knew nothing of truth. Grace, torn between gratitude for Caleb and the reality of her situation, began to feel the walls closing in. The village's demand for reparation grew louder, their whispers evolving into outright suggestions. A marriage, they said, would restore her honor and silence the scandal. Grace recoiled at the thought, her mind filled with a storm of emotions. Caleb's face appeared in her thoughts, his quiet strength, his unwavering kindness, but she couldn't imagine binding her life to his out of obligation. And yet, the alternative, living as an outcast, seemed equally unbearable. As the village's judgment reached its peak, Grace realized there was no easy path forward. Her honor, her family's livelihood, and even Caleb's reputation were now intertwined in a web she couldn't escape. The pressure to make a decision loomed over her like a storm cloud, its weight suffocating. She knew that whatever choice she made would change her life forever, but the question of what was right remained unanswered. In her heart, she felt the pull of survival, of finding a way to navigate this cruel and unyielding world. Little did she know, the next chapter of her life would test her resolve in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The proposal for a forced marriage was not presented as a suggestion, but as a solution, a way to restore what the village called balance. Grace sat across from Caleb in her father's dimly lit tavern, the weight of the villagers' judgment pressing down on them both. Caleb, ever the silent protector, watched her with a guarded expression, his presence steady yet unreadable. For Grace, the idea of marrying a man she barely knew felt like yet another prison. Yet the alternative was unthinkable. The whispers had grown into shouts, and the village demanded an answer. Caleb, though stoic, felt the sting of being thrust into such a situation. His life of solitude had been a shield against the world's complexities, but now he found himself drawn into Grace's storm. He didn't ask for this union, nor did he resist it, understanding that to refuse would leave Grace's reputation in shreds. Honor was a concept he held dear, though not in the rigid way the village did. To him, this marriage was less about appeasing others and more about protecting someone who had been caught in the cruel crosshairs of societal expectations. The wedding was a quiet affair, held in the village church under the watchful eyes of those who had judged her. Grace stood in a borrowed gown, her hands trembling as she exchanged vows with Caleb. There was no love in the air, no joyful celebration, only a somber acknowledgement of duty. Caleb's voice was steady as he spoke his vows, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that was both reassuring and unnerving. Grace, though hesitant, met his eyes, wondering if this union could ever be more than a forced arrangement. The days that followed were a blur of adjustments, both to their new roles and to the life they were expected to build together. Caleb's cabin, though sturdy, was far from welcoming, its sparse interior a reflection of his solitary existence. Grace, used to the warmth of the tavern, found the silence of the woods deafening. Their personalities clashed in subtle ways. Her need for connection met with his preference for quiet. Her determination to rebuild her life contrasted with his resigned acceptance of their situation. Survival, it seemed, would require more than just shelter and food. Yet, as they settled into their new reality, moments of understanding began to emerge. Caleb, though reserved, showed his care in small, deliberate actions, fixing a loose plank, ensuring she had the warmest blanket, hunting enough to stock their pantry. Grace, in turn, brought a liveliness to the cabin, filling it with small touches that softened its edges. Their conversations, though sparse, grew in depth, each word peeling back layers of mistrust and uncertainty. In the quiet of their forced union, something unexpected began to take root: empathy. The village, satisfied by their union, turned its attention elsewhere, leaving Grace and Caleb to navigate their fragile partnership. Though the pressure had subsided, the scars of what they had endured lingered. Grace, ever resourceful, began to see the marriage not as a sentence but as a challenge, one she was determined to meet with strength and resolve. Caleb, for his part, found himself drawn to her resilience, her ability to find light even in the darkest of circumstances. They were two people brought together by necessity, yet each held the potential to change the other in ways neither could predict. Despite their growing bond, the challenges of survival in the wilderness tested them daily. Wolves prowled the outskirts of their land, storms battered their cabin, and the weight of their pasts hung over them like a shadow. But in those trials, Grace and Caleb discovered something deeper, a strength they hadn't known they possessed. The foundation of their marriage, though built under pressure, began to solidify into something real. As they faced each hardship, the lines between duty and desire blurred, hinting at a future neither had dared to dream of. And yet, the true test of their bond was still to come. Life in the wilderness was relentless, a constant battle against nature that left no room for complacency. For Grace and Caleb, survival became a shared purpose, forcing them to rely on each other in ways they hadn't anticipated. The first test came when a pack of wolves encroached on their land, their howls echoing in the cold night air. Caleb's instincts as a knight took over as he prepared to defend their home, while Grace stood by, her fear giving way to a determination to protect the life they were building. Together, they faced the danger, each action speaking of trust that words couldn't convey. The cabin, though sturdy, bore the marks of time and neglect, demanding constant care. Grace, with her eye for detail, began repairing what she could, her hands becoming calloused from the work. Caleb, though used to solitude, found himself drawn into her efforts, their teamwork creating a rhythm that felt almost natural. Each repaired beam, every fixed window, became a testament to their growing partnership. The cabin, once a reflection of Caleb's solitary life, started to transform into a home, warm, welcoming, and alive with Grace's touch. In the quiet moments between their struggles, Grace and Caleb began to share pieces of themselves. She spoke of the tavern, of the laughter and life she missed, and the judgment she'd endured. Caleb, in turn, revealed fragments of his past, a life of duty, betrayal, and the choice to leave it all behind. These stories, though painful, became a bridge between them, building a bond rooted in empathy and understanding. They were two souls shaped by survival, finding solace in the fact that neither had to face the world alone anymore. As the seasons changed, so did their relationship. The snowstorm struggles that had once defined their dynamic gave way to moments of quiet companionship. Caleb, once a man of few words, began to appreciate Grace's chatter, her ability to bring life to even the most mundane tasks. Grace, in turn, saw past Caleb's stoic exterior to the man beneath, a protector, a partner, and perhaps something more. Their bond wasn't forged in grand gestures, but in the small, everyday acts of care that spoke of a deeper connection. One day, while repairing the roof, Grace slipped, her scream slicing through the air as she clung to the edge. Caleb was there in an instant, his strong hands pulling her to safety. The fear in his eyes as he held her spoke volumes, and for the first time, Grace saw just how much she had come to mean to him. In that moment, the distance between them seemed to dissolve, replaced by a sense of belonging that neither could ignore. Their relationship, once defined by necessity, began to take on a new shape, one of choice. The challenges they faced weren't limited to the physical. There were days when doubts crept in, when the weight of their pasts threatened to pull them apart. But each trial only served to strengthen their resolve, reminding them of how far they had come. Grace, with her unyielding spirit, pushed Caleb to open up, to let her in. Caleb, in turn, became Grace's anchor, grounding her when the world seemed too heavy to bear. Their bond was far from perfect, but it was real, messy, raw, and undeniably theirs. As spring approached, the snow began to melt, revealing a world that felt full of possibilities. Grace and Caleb stood side by side, looking out at the land they had worked so hard to make their own. The trials they had faced together had forged a bond neither had expected, a partnership built on trust, respect, and something that felt like the beginnings of love. Yet, as the world around them thawed, they knew their greatest challenges were still ahead. The journey they had started was far from over, and the future remained an unwritten story waiting to unfold.